All right, welcome to part 2 of the Unit 4 introductory notes. I'm just going to go ahead and pick up where I left off. So, after the war in 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution outlawed slavery everywhere in the United States of America. And there were still some issues with this, but seeing as we had just fought a war for the last several years, we were more or less able to lessen the issue, not completely eradicate it, which, again, we'll talk about a little bit later. So President Lincoln felt that the South should not be punished for succeeding. He wanted to bring the country back together peacefully and as quickly as possible. However, his efforts were incredibly short-lived because he was assassinated just days after the war's ending. A man by the name of John Wilkes Booth snuck up behind Lincoln while he was watching a play and shot him in the back of the head. He and several other members of this conspiracy were hanged to death. So after his death, other members of Congress imposed military rule on the South and passed laws to protect the rights of the newly freed slaves, including the right to vote. Now, this obviously caused some more tensions, but it was also short-lived because the South eventually got power and overruled those laws, essentially. So during Reconstruction, projects that had been interrupted by the Civil War, resumed, and the U.S. continued its westward expansion, developing more states all the way until it reached what is now the state of California. As Reconstruction dragged on, Southerners gradually retook control of the state governments in the South, passing laws to undermine the rights of African Americans. They did this in a kind of shady way. They did things like the Grandfather Act, which was, it pretty much said you could not vote if you were an African American if your grandfather couldn't vote. And your grandfather definitely couldn't vote because the rule was just passed. And there were rules that had to do with, like you had to be able to read and write, but it was illegal to teach slaves how to read and write. So you can look into some of these laws. They're really quite ridiculous, but they did anything and everything to undermine the laws that Congress had originally passed to protect the newly freed slaves and their rights. So in 1877, a compromise allowed Republican Rutherford B. Hayes to become president in exchange for the end of the federal control over the South. This event in particular marked the end of Reconstruction, which probably not the best decision, but hey, hindsight 2020. So the rise of realism. The Civil War changed not only American society, but its literature as well. With all great movements, we see the culture affects literature, which is why we take the time to study these things. So northern and southern writers, black and white, male and female, high-ranking officers and lowly foot soldiers, and the women they left behind all express different perspectives of their wartime experiences through diaries and letters. And these diaries and letters became huge portions of the literature of this period. You can still find entire books of letters that were written between, couples that were separated by the war, or families that had people fighting on both sides, which often happened. And it's very interesting to read some of these stories. And if you take this into perspective of what we're seeing today, so some of the conflicts, for example, in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, all these regions, if you were to look at the correspondence of these people or the diaries of these people, we would get some of the same insight that we get when we read Civil War literature. Now, in contrast to these personal accounts were the public pronouncements of President Lincoln, whose inspiring Gettysburg Address proved to be one of the most enduring works of the Civil War. We still read the Gettysburg Address today. We read actually quite a few of the speeches that President Lincoln gave because of the quality of the speech. But what he was putting forth was quite different from these more private texts that we have now made public. After the war, writers rejected Romanticism and began writing honest, unsentimental, and ironic fiction. So this is where we get realism. Realism really starts in America because people are fed up with the crap. They don't want this frilly stuff. They want the truth. And the Civil War, it got the ball rolling in this. So the people that wrote these texts, called realists, writers such as Stephen Crane, for example, focused on the human tragedy of war. These writers would have a notable impact on the writing that followed at the turn of the century, aka 1900. As again, we stepped into 2 more wars in the first 50 years. Now, in order to get full credit for your notes, which you should have been taking throughout this whole lecture, you also have to answer the following 3 questions. So I'll take a second and I will stop on each slide, pause the video. You can write just the number of the question and then the letter next to the correct answer. That's fine. But I'll be looking for this at the end of the notes that you submit to Google Classroom, which you will be taking pictures of and submitting. All right, guys, if you have any questions about this lesson, these notes, or anything like that, just let me know, and I will post another assignment in a couple days. See you then.